welcome everyone. So I was about to say that we hope it's okay. The meeting is being recorded because we want to make this available to other people who weren't able to attend. So what we will do is we'll just do some introductions. There's a few different professionals on the call who are going to talk to you and then answer questions at the end. My name's Tamsin. I'm a consultant midwife in public health and safeguarding at Homerton Hospital. And then we've got Sandra. Do you want to introduce yourself, Sandra?
Yeah, good evening everyone. I'm Sandra Husbands and I'm the Director of Public Health for the City of London and Hackney.
Thank you. Christine.
Hi, hello everybody. My name's Christine. I'm one of the health visiting leads in the Homerton, so welcome.
Deborah.
Hi there, I'm Deborah. I live locally. I had my baby in Homerton last September. And I recently had the vaccine whilst breastfeeding, so I'm going to be speaking a bit later about that.
Lovely, thank you. And then Lauren.
Hi, I'm Lauren Ward. I'm a GP and I'm a clinical lead for maternity care in City and Hackney.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, so I think what we're going to do first is Sandra's going to take us through a bit of the science behind the vaccine, and she's got a few slides to show us on that.
Thanks, Tamsin. So can I have my first slide, please? I want to start by saying, yeah, that was the one with the baby. I want to start by saying that public health, that's the one. That public health interventions, of all the public health interventions, vaccinations is one of the most it's one of the most effective ones. You know, so after clean water, there was a point in the not too distant past whenever I told people I worked in public health, they thought it was something to do with drains. But we all have access to clean water now in this country, and we all have access to vaccinations, and the two combined are the most effective public health interventions that we have. And in fact, vaccinating children is one of the most cost-effective public health interventions in the history of medicine. So just to give you that context before I go into the detail about how vaccines work and how the COVID vaccines were made and licensed, and in particular how they were made and licensed so quickly, so that you can understand a bit more about them and help you make your decision. Can I have the next slide, please? So all vaccines work by training your immune system. So in the same way that if you were going to start, you know, if you wanted to say run the London Marathon in September, you wouldn't just wake up on the morning of the marathon and join the queue and run 26.1 miles, because your muscles wouldn't be able to do it. Not to mention that the blisters on your feet would be unbearable. You'd have to train your body to get into shape in order to be able to do a marathon. And so in the same way that you train your muscles, you can train your immune system. It has memory, as we call it, which means that once it's seen some sort of foreign invader before, or something that mimics the foreign invader before, it's armed and ready, so it can mount a more effective response against it when it sees it again. So that's what vaccines do, is they train your immune system by mimicking the foreign invaders, whether it's a virus or a bacteria or a fungus, and they show you something harmless that mimics the real virus or the real bacteria, so that your immune system starts developing antibodies and arming its T cells, so that if it then encounters that thing again in terms of the real infection, it says, I remember this, and it's able to mount a much more rapid and a much bigger response against it than it would have done if it had just met it for the first time. So they don't necessarily stop somebody passing on the infection to you, or you picking it up from something that you've touched. But what it does is that it arms your immune system so that you are able to very quickly snuff that infection out. And they work to varying degrees, which we can go into a bit later. So that's how they work, all of them. Different vaccines are made in different ways. And can I have the next slide? And this slide goes into the detail about the COVID vaccines that we have available in this country at the moment, which are those three: the Pfizer, BioNTech and Moderna, which are mRNA vaccines, and the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson one, which will be coming on stream, is in a similar group to the Oxford AstraZeneca one. So along the top there, it's basically telling you how clinical trials work. And this would be the same, regardless of whether it was the vaccine or any other kind of medicine. There would be an element of the process, which is the scientific experiments. So there's even a box before you get to that preclinical trial bit there, where the scientists are trying to, and medical researchers are trying to understand, well, what causes this? What is the organism that causes this infection? What does it look like? What type of virus is it? What do we know about this family of viruses? And in terms of the virus that causes COVID-19, it's very similar. It's in the same family to the virus that causes SARS, which you may remember from the early noughties caused a previous pandemic, which didn't hit this country, but caused significant harm across the globe. And do forgive me rubbing my nose from time to time. I went out today and it's a bit of a high pollen day. So there was a lot of preclinical science that we already knew about this type of virus, and also some work going on where they were trying to develop vaccines against the original SARS virus. And that's one of the reasons that we had a bit of a head start in terms of vaccine development against this particular virus. So once they've used whatever technology they are using to develop the vaccine itself, there's then some preclinical trials where they test it in animals just to make sure it's not toxic, in the sense that it's not going to cause, it's not going to kill them, it's not going to cause significant harm, you're not going to have a massive, what we call a cytokine storm, which is like an overstimulation of your immune system, all of which could be harmful, including looking at the impact it has on pregnancy in the mice in which they test it on. And you know, that's as a result of the thalidomide scandal that happened many years ago, where some a drug that was used for morning sickness hadn't been tested effectively, and in other countries where they had gone through this test to look at the impact it had on pregnancy, they didn't have the same issue, and it was never licensed for use in pregnant women because they realized it was causing abnormalities in the baby rats. So then that's the first preclinical bit, and it's, once it's past that, you know that it's not got any significant toxic effects, then you have the first phase, the phase 1 clinical trial, where it's then tried in smaller numbers of human volunteers who are healthy, where what you're looking for is partly to see if it's having any toxic effects in humans that didn't show up in the mice. Obviously, or whatever other animal you tested it in, obviously they wouldn't give it to people if it had been overtly toxic in animals. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is where you try it in a larger number of people, and what you're looking for there in the context of a vaccine is it producing an immune response? So can we measure antibodies to the vaccine in the people that we've given this vaccine to, compared to another group that didn't have the vaccine? And so once you know it's actually doing what you think it's supposed to do, then you go into the phase 3 trial, which is to see if there's any clinical effect. So does it prevent the infections? Does it prevent people getting sick? Does it prevent them dying? And that's phase 3. So you're looking for the proper clinical effect, the effect that you want to see in the phase 3 trial. So in each of those trials, you know, from phase 1 to phase 3, you do it in bigger and bigger numbers of people. And then, of course, you submit all of the trial results to the various regulatory bodies. So in this country, it's the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or MHRA. You may also have heard of the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, which does a similar thing, and the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, for the EU. And there are many, obviously, every country has its own regulatory system, but in this country, the MHRA, they look at all of the results and determine whether the results are really showing what the researchers are saying that they are, and both in terms of, is it effective? And in the context of the vaccines, obviously, are these vaccines effective? Are they doing what we think they should be doing in terms of preventing people getting sick? And are they safe? Now, with every medicine, every vaccine, there will be some people who have side effects. So it's always a balance of risks, even if you just took a paracetamol that you bought over the counter. So it's a balance of risk between the therapeutic effect that you want, or the immune stimulation effect that you want from a vaccine, and the possible side effects that you get from it. And as long as the balance of risks is in favor of the vaccines, and that the side effects that they see from the trials are in a small enough number of people and not terribly serious, then it will get approval. And then the phase 4 trial that it refers to there is sometimes called post-marketing surveillance. And what that means is once the vaccine's been released into the market and loads of people have had it, we can continue to monitor what's happening. And in this country, we do that through what we call the yellow card system, where people who have adverse reactions, side effects, whatever, they may feel a bit unwell in one way or another after they've had their vaccine. And it could be several days later, it might be weeks later, but if they report it, their doctor, they now report it online. In the old days, they used to actually literally write it on a yellow card, which is why it's called that, and report that to the MHRA, and they will log all of them. So it doesn't have to be proven to have been caused by the vaccine, but they will collate all of that information and try to understand it in the context of how many people have had vaccines and how many of these side effects, the specific side effects that people are reporting, how many do we see? So to just try to help you understand the difference between the two types of vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, and this is the one I want to focus on a bit because it's the one that's going to be offered to, the only one that's being offered in this country to people under 40, and in particular if you're pregnant, the Pfizer vaccine in particular, because there's a lot of particularly post-marketing surveillance, but also some trial evidence about its safety in pregnancy, is the one that will be offered to women who are already pregnant. So, and I will go into the detail on another slide about how an mRNA vaccine works. But these two types of vaccines are different. So one is delivers this mRNA into your body, and then the mRNA, your own cell machinery uses the mRNA to then make a protein which looks like the virus protein, and then your body recognizes it as a foreign protein and starts making antibodies and stimulates the T cell, so that when you see that same protein on the outside of the virus, you think, oh yes, your immune system thinks, you don't have any conscious thoughts about this usually. I've seen this before. I'm going to make some antibodies and make lots of antibodies. On the other hand, the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines introduce that same protein, but on the surface of a harmless virus. And so you still have the same immune response where you see something that stimulates your immune system, but is not the thing that gives you the disease. So really importantly, the vaccines cannot cause COVID-19 because they don't have any COVID-19 virus in them. So can I have the next slide? So this was to tell you how mRNA vaccines work. So I could spend quite a long time explaining the difference between RNA and DNA, but that could probably take the whole hour, so I'm not going to do that. But just to be clear, mRNA is genetic material, but is completely distinct from DNA. But what it does is it provides a template for your cell machinery to make a protein. So we produce our own mRNA, and viruses have mRNA, and this is what that means. So it's giving you the template to make the virus protein, and then you get injected, the mRNA gets into your cell, and a bit like I just described, actually, your cell machinery makes the virus protein, and then your immune cells think, oh yes, that's foreign, and will be able to make make a response against it. It doesn't make responses to your own proteins because it knows that they belong to you. That's a very complicated, long-winded story I won't go into either. Was the subject of my PhD thesis in immunology a really long time ago, about how you recognise the difference between what's foreign and what's not. And it took me 3 years, so I'm not going to explain that to you tonight. But if we move on to the next slide, I've explained a bit about how we know they're safe, because they've been through the same trial processes as any other vaccine, and they've been passed by the regulators. But why would you need to have a vaccine if you've had COVID in the past? Because obviously you've been exposed to that protein. I said already that your immune system has memory and it makes a better response. But what we know from people who've had COVID is that their natural immunity wanes. We know that because we can measure antibodies and show that the level of antibodies is going down. We also know that some people have had more than one infection. It's a small number of people, but we do know that they've had that has happened. So getting a vaccine will just give your immune system another boost. So it's a bit like, you know, you trained for the marathon last year, you did the marathon, and then you stopped training. You're not going to be able to maintain the memory to do a marathon in a year's time without doing a bit more training. Why were they able to make the vaccines so quickly and get them approved so quickly? It was a combination of the fact that there'd been all this scientific research going on into SARS type viruses from back in the early noughties, and the technology for making the vaccines, whether the RNA vaccines in particular, which is fairly new vaccine technology, being developed over several years as well, and being used to make the Ebola vaccine from a few years ago that you might remember. But also a combination of luck, because this is actually the first time anyone's been able to successfully make any vaccines, let alone so many, against a coronavirus. But also a massive international collaboration between academic researchers in universities and pharmaceutical companies, backed up by the investment, the massive amounts of money, but also guaranteed investment, mainly from governments, and then an enormous number of people coming forward and volunteering to be participants in the trial, quite often in the clinical trial. I'm going to sound like I've had a really checkered past, but I also used to run clinical trials in the past, and it's actually one of the hardest things about them is recruiting people into them. And actually, in this case, across the world, tens of thousands of people came. In fact, just in this country, on the NHS registry, you could sign up to be a volunteer. Tens of thousands of people came forward to volunteer. That's unprecedented. So an unprecedented amount of money, an unprecedented amount of collaboration rather than competition, an unprecedented number of trial participants, and then the misfortune of having such a lot of infections circulating at the time that meant that we could very quickly see whether the vaccines were effective or not, meant that they were able to go from a scientific concept to a product to testing it effectively in a relatively short time. The other thing that happened was that all of the research groups that were working on this sort of compressed those trial phases that I talked about, so that as soon as they knew from the animal studies that it wasn't going to kill them, they started with their phase 1 trials in humans, and even before they'd finished all of those and spent a few months publishing the data or whatever, they started the phase 2 trials, and similarly they went into the phase 3 trials. And at the same time, in this country, which is one of the reasons that the UK was able to approve the vaccines before anywhere else, the MHRA was being given the results, the data from all of the different trials at the same time as they were going on, so that they were looking at the information and evaluating it before it was published, so that by the time they got to the end of the phase 3 trials and said, okay, we've got a product that we know works and we want it to be licensed, there was less work to do to evaluate all of the results and make a determination about whether it could be granted a license for, or they, I should say, could be granted licenses for being safe and effective. And that's how the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines got approved so quickly in the UK last year. So a couple of things I just want to mention before I hand over to my colleague is that there are side effects, like as I mentioned earlier, with any other vaccine, there are side effects. The vast majority of people have very mild side effects, mainly the kind of things that you would imagine that they might have, like pain around the injection site. Sometimes you might get what the nurse said to me when I had mine was you might get a dead arm from it, and you know, these are things that are just treated with things like paracetamol. Some people get headaches. Some people feel, you know, the next day or two that a sort of a flu-like illness. It's not flu. It's just your immune system, the inflammatory response to the vaccine, making you feel a little unwell and a little feverish, which is often why people think they get flu from a flu vaccination. It's just the natural response to the vaccine, but not an actual episode of illness. And the vast majority of the side effects are mild and short-lived. And as you know, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, there's a very rare blood clotting disorder that occurs in some people. And even though it's very rare, it does seem to be more common, still rare, but more common in younger people, which is why they're only being offered the Pfizer vaccine in this country.
Okay, so we'll carry on. Thank you so much for that, Sandra. That was really, really interesting and helpful. And I just wanted to say thanks to everybody who sent questions in via the Instagram a couple of weeks ago on the Maternity Services Instagram. What we've tried to do is collect them into groups of questions that were about different things, and then we'll go through some answers. So one of the questions that we had through was about when in pregnancy is the best time to have the vaccine. Happily, you can actually have the vaccine at any stage. Some people are choosing to have it a little bit later on in their pregnancy because the risk has been shown to be greater when you're in later pregnancy, but you actually don't need to wait at all. And we have had lots of pregnant women having their vaccine very early on in their pregnancies. And then really, it's up to you to kind of balance up when you want to have it with your own other risk factors, and also with looking at the community transmission levels as well, to decide actually, you know what, if it's going to take me, you know, a certain amount of time to become fully vaccinated, I might as well start now. I can get vaccinated sooner. And actually, if we're looking at a situation where there's quite a lot of community transmission, it might be a really good idea to get started sooner rather than later. Another question that we had in was about the vaccine side effects. So Sandra was talking about the vaccine side effects, and, you know, very much it's an individual thing. I was giving some of the vaccines to some of our health and social colleagues at the hospital, and when people were coming back for their second doses, I was asking everybody how much they'd had in the way of side effects, and it really, really varied. I was a lucky person who didn't have any at all, and then I would say it's probably about 50-50. Other people did have some side effects, ranging, as Sandra was saying, from something that was quite mild to something where the people were feeling a bit more under the weather for a couple of days. I think actually a study that was published recently looking in the US at about 35,000 pregnancies found that pregnant people reported more pain in the injection site, so that kind of dead arm that Sandra was talking about, but actually less in terms of headaches, muscle pain, chills and fever. So it might be that some of those side effects are a bit more mild in pregnancy. We had a couple of questions about whether the vaccine crosses the placenta, and if that does happen, if it, you know, people are hearing that that doesn't happen, but then how does the baby get antibodies? So this comes down to the fact that actually the vaccine itself goes into your body and it does its thing, and then the ingredients for the vaccine leaves. But as Sandra was talking about before, the antibodies are created, and antibodies for lots of things will be passed through the placenta to your baby. So if you have the vaccine and you make some COVID antibodies, then those can be gifted, and it looks like there's emerging evidence that they will be gifted to your baby and then offer a level of protection. So we also have seen research that said wanted to look at the placenta just to make sure, even though there was no biological way that we thought this would happen, we wanted to make sure that the placentas looked healthy. It didn't have any effect on the placentas, which is obviously how the baby receives all its oxygen or its nutrients from the mum. And so they studied placentas of women who had had COVID vaccines during pregnancy, and there was absolutely no difference between them whatsoever. So we can be confident about that. Another question we had was around, you know, the monitoring of this all being fairly new and recent, and how many babies have been born, how many full pregnancies have been studied. So actually lots of the women who have had the vaccine in the USA were in their 3rd trimester when they had the vaccine. But actually more and more women are giving birth every day who have had the vaccine at various times during their pregnancy. So we are seeing more and more women who have had a full pregnancy after a vaccination with no adverse outcomes. Somebody else asked about whether there was any evidence that the vaccine makes morning sickness worse. And I think that one's a simple no. There's no evidence that any of us are aware of that that's the case. Again, if you were feeling very unwell with morning sickness and nausea, you might want to wait until that's eased off a bit, just because if you did happen to get some side effects, you might feel even worse. So you could wait a little bit until that's eased off. If you're having very severe sickness and nausea, you should see your GP or your midwife and come and talk to us anyway. Separate issue. So I think one of the big questions for people who are having babies is around whether there are any known risks to the baby. And the answer again is no, there are no known risks to babies, and we actually would never recommend something where we thought there was a risk to babies, to pregnant women. So we know that that is the most important thing to you all. The flip side of that is being that actually we do know there are risks to of getting COVID during pregnancy to both the mother and the baby. And we know that there's an increased risk of preterm birth and a very small, and all these risks are very small because risk can be a bit tricky to understand, but there's an increase in the risk of stillbirth and in mothers becoming so unwell during pregnancy, and particularly during that last trimester, so the last 12 weeks of pregnancy, becoming so unwell that they might need care in intensive care. So that's really unwell people. So lots of people wondering how do we know it's safe for pregnant women, and I think actually that some of what Sandra was saying about the biological way that the vaccines work and how much evidence we have about what they do inside our bodies is what reassures us as health professionals. So just to recap, the Moderna and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines, they're mRNA vaccines. They don't contain any live virus. They can't give you mRNA, they can't give you COVID-19. They don't interact with any of your DNA. And really it's like, I was trying to think of a good analogy because I love a good analogy. And it was a bit like, you know, the delivery guy comes and delivers your pizza when you order it on a well-known delivery website, but he doesn't come in and eat the pizza for you. You eat the pizza and then he leaves. So, well, he probably leaves before you eat the pizza. But I think it's this feeling where it gives your body a tool and then the body does the work itself. So I was looking at the numbers, and I think one of the big reasons that in the UK the recommendation was made that it would be okay and recommended for women to have this in pregnancy, this vaccine, is actually that so many people in the USA during pregnancy have had this vaccine, and it's been found to be really, really, really safe. So I looked up the numbers. The most recent numbers in the USA were from the 6th of July, so a couple of weeks ago now, and 130,435 people during pregnancy had the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, and they have had no adverse effects reported. So I think that's what makes us feel very confident, the science that we know about and this evidence from all the people who have had this, that we feel very confident about recommending this for pregnant women. Then what else? So lots again of questions about knowing the implications for unborn babies when it's so new, about long-term, you know, outcomes. And I think I don't want to repeat myself again, but I think we feel confident about this because we know about vaccines and how your pregnancy and your immune system works. So pregnant women have other vaccines routinely. We offer the flu vaccine and we offer the whooping cough vaccine, and we have really good safety data for those too. And it's a bit like you know, a different version of the same thing, really, because we know these vaccines are safe and we know that they offer really good protection to mum and also to baby. And particularly with the whooping cough, we're giving that vaccine to the mum, but it actually is for the baby to protect the baby in the first few weeks of life. So what else were we looking at? So there was a specific question about having the vaccine if you're on blood thinning injections after a C-section. Some people have those blood thinning injections during pregnancy as well if they've got certain risk factors. And the answer is yes, it is very safe to have a vaccine when you're having those blood thinning injections. So lots of people who aren't pregnant are on blood thinners, and actually being a vaccinator of somebody, it's one of the questions that we ask. And if somebody's on blood thinning injections, we would use an even smaller needle, so a very, very small needle, and we would put pressure on the site where we had put the vaccination in for 2 minutes, just because you're a little bit more likely to bleed. So we make sure we put that pressure on there, and then you're good to go. And then you're protected as well. So it's absolutely safe to do that if you're taking Clexane or another blood thinning injection. And then the last one that I was going to address that was a question about whether we can vaccinate people during pregnancy at the antenatal clinic. So we have 2 vaccination nurses who are lovely, who do our flu and pertussis whooping cough vaccines. But at the moment, we can't offer the COVID vaccines at the hospital. And that the reason for that is because the ones that we are giving on the non-maternity side are the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not one of the recommended vaccines for pregnant people. And there's some storage issues with the Pfizer one. It needs to be very cold and you need to use a certain amount. And because we wouldn't have really, really large numbers, it doesn't really make sense at the moment. That might change with the different vaccines that are becoming available, but we will let everyone know if that becomes a possibility. Okay. I think what we will do now is we will invite Christine to talk about some of the questions that you sent in about COVID-19 and breastfeeding, because this was a really big topic for your questions that came in. Christine.
Lovely, thank you, Tamsin, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for taking the time to come along. And I know there's some questions in the chat, and at the end of the session we will look at some of those questions for you. So please keep putting your questions there. So there were a few questions, a bit like Tamsin's just talked about pregnancy and relating to breastfeeding. And obviously that's something that women make a decision, they think about that when they're pregnant and when they deliver the baby. So yeah, just to go through some of those. So how soon after birth can I get my vaccine if I'm breastfeeding? And the recommendation is that you can receive the vaccine really as soon as you're ready. So obviously you're recovering from the delivery, but there's no delay or time frame. So obviously as a woman, if you would like to have your vaccine, that would be available for you. Obviously in the community, there's sessions, so that's good news really, so it's good. How safe is it really to get a vaccine whilst breastfeeding? What do we know about the long-term impact? Well, I think what I would like to reassure people is there's lots of oversight and research looking at this. There's emerging evidence that antibodies from vaccine or the infection pass through the breast milk. So when you're feeding, it's a way of the baby receiving that immunity, so those antibodies. And it will offer some protection to the babies, although obviously there's ongoing research about how much immunity it offers the baby. But when I think the first part of that question, how safe is it really to get the vaccine? I think the information that Sandra shared, I think is really important to understand what the purpose of the vaccine is and how it protects you and then can protect your baby. And breastfeeding is a really useful way to do that. Yeah, so something to think about. Next question was, do we know what protection, if any, the vaccine gives to babies of breastfeeding mothers? And I think with that, we don't know exactly what level of protection it gives, or for how long. And that might be dependent on the amount of breast milk that's being offered to baby. But what we do know is that the emerging evidence shows that there is some transference of antibodies through the breast milk. And that happens with other conditions, and I think Tamsin has spoken about. Currently, women are offered the flu and the whooping cough immunisation, and that's for exactly the same reason, that it offers that immunity to babies. So I can't tell you here and now exactly what level, but does offer some protection to baby, which is really important. Rather than a question, there's kind of a statement: I'm anxious about any effect on my newborn. And I hear that, and I understand that, you know, having a new baby, that might cause some anxiety. Certainly all the recommendations we have guide us to know that we're not aware of any negative impacts for baby, and actually any effects there might be would be positive, and that would be about baby having that extra protection from the antibodies. And certainly as an organisation, as a National Health Service, if there was any concern, that would be shared with women. So I think there's lots of assurance that actually offering breast milk to your baby would offer that additional level of protection for your newborn. So which vaccine is best when breastfeeding? I think that's already been covered by Sandra and Tamsin. So obviously at the moment you would be offered Pfizer-BioNTech or the Moderna vaccine, and that's really in line with what we would offer people under the age of 40 years. And although we might have some pregnant women who would be older than 40 years, generally they would be the vaccines that would be offered because they're deemed to be the safest. But obviously, if you came to have your immunisation, you could discuss that with the person offering you the immunisation, or your GP, or your midwife, or health visitor. There's a question about breastfeeding a premature baby once having the vaccine, and I think there, what I would say, I think we all know that obviously premature babies, we know, are more vulnerable to infection, and obviously the impact of offering breast milk, which we know will have antibodies in it, would offer that extra level of, or that layer of protection. So I would say, if any of you do have your baby slightly early, do really consider that. Breast milk offers, you know, a real protection for your baby. Absolutely safe. There's no evidence to suggest that it shouldn't be offered. And it's the last question, I think, is what's known about the vaccine and the impact on breastfeeding. I think what we know is there's no direct impact on breastfeeding, so you will still produce milk. That milk will contain antibodies, but it will have no impact on the volume of breast milk you'll be producing, or how you feed your baby, or so really to reassure you, I think breastfeeding is something, that's the choice you make for your baby, it's a really positive choice to protect your baby. So I hope that's really helpful for you, and good luck with whatever your choice is. So
thank you
to you, Tamsin.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine. That was brilliant. I'd like to invite Deborah just to talk about her experience of having the vaccine.
Hi there. Yeah, so I had my daughter early September, and I had my first vaccine around mid-February, so quite early. And I was just breastfeeding her at the time. She was around 5 months old. And I guess I initially did have concerns, but then I think I weighed it up in a number of ways. And part of the decision was, we heard of lots of people dying from having COVID-19, but you didn't hear of lots of people dying from having the vaccine. And I also had the concern of actually getting sick with COVID and having to look after my daughter at the same time, and how that would affect me. So it was an analysis like, you know, what's the bigger risk? And I guess with any of these things, there's always a risk, but actually I thought the risk of getting COVID and looking after my daughter might be harder. I actually had AstraZeneca, because again, it was an earlier vaccine. I personally had side effects the first time where I had flu-like symptoms and felt quite ill, but I didn't have any with the second vaccine. And I didn't see any symptoms in my daughter when I was breastfeeding her, and I carried on breastfeeding throughout. Some people did suggest to me for the few days that after I'd had the vaccine that I could use previously expressed milk and then pump and just get rid of the breast milk just straight after I've had the vaccine. But I chose not to. And yeah, I'm really happy with my decision. I'm really happy to have the vaccine. I think I would also have it in pregnancy as well. And that was my experience of it. I can ask a question, you don't have to answer it. The question I would ask is, to my daughter, I had my daughter via IVF, and I don't know if there's any impact in taking the vaccine if you're going through IVF treatment. So that would be a question, but you don't have to answer it. I've just taken the liberty because I'm speaking.
That's all right, Deborah. Thank you so much. And thanks for sharing your experience with us. I think one of the things that we've put up on the maternity Instagram account today is a couple of videos from one. We've got a video, I think Pascal might actually be on the call now, who's one of our labour ward coordinators who had her second dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine during her pregnancy. So there's a little video about her talking about that. And we've also got a video of one of our midwives who, similarly to you, Deborah, had her vaccine whilst breastfeeding her son as well. So it's really nice to hear. Someone's asking what the Instagram link is. We can share that in the chat, I think, but it is homerton.maternity if you want to look up our Instagram account. Yes, and I think actually there were some questions about if you'd had your first dose of AstraZeneca and then found out you were pregnant, about whether you should have that second dose. And the advice is that, yes, you should go ahead and have that second dose. There are some trials at the moment that are looking at mixing different vaccines, but at the moment, those are just trials. So we're recommending if you've had your first dose of AstraZeneca, you should have the second one, and that's safe to do as well. The reason at the moment, and I'm sure Sandra will come in if I've got this wrong, but the reason that at the moment the recommended vaccines are the Pfizer and the Moderna is because of the amount of evidence from the US that we have about women in pregnancy having those vaccines. It's not that we think there's something unsafe about the AstraZeneca, but then it's also about the age recommendation. So most women who are coming through in pregnancy are in the age bracket where they would be recommended to have the Pfizer or the Moderna anyway. So yes, was there something else I was going to say about that?
Just to add, that's exactly right, Tamsin.
Okay, great, good.
It is just about how much evidence there is.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing that has come through, a couple of people have contacted us through the maternity Instagram, and because I'm one of the people who runs the maternity Instagram, will have a couple of chats with people if they message us, and they have found that sometimes the people who are calling to offer them the vaccines are a little bit nervous about, well, you know, saying whether they think a pregnant person or a, you know, postnatal person should get the vaccine or not, because obviously it's a very individualized decision. I think there's also a little bit of nervousness about recommending things to pregnant people if you're not a midwife or somebody who works regularly with pregnant people, just because people are a little bit scared about recommending anything to pregnant women. But I think that the reason we're putting these videos up of midwives who have had the vaccine is to show you that actually, you know, people who work in the health service and routinely think and talk to pregnant women and think about pregnancy and read up and learn about pregnancy even more, we're all having the vaccine and we think it's really safe. And if I was pregnant, I would have the vaccine. I mean, I've already had it, so I can't have it again, but it's a really, really good, positive step that you can take to protect yourself. Just to, you know, it's like avoiding certain foods, or, you know, all the other things that we do to protect ourselves and keep safe and well during pregnancy. It's another one of those things that you can use to keep yourself and your baby well, really. I'm just looking at the agenda because I know I've gone off track. I think we were going to talk about how you can get vaccinated, weren't we? Yes. Lauren, were you going to talk about this? Because GPs are contacting their Sorry, I think I might just be inviting you to talk about something that you weren't ready to talk about. But.
That's fine. I hadn't planned to, but
Lauren, you can, or perhaps Amy can, or I can. This was just. Did you want to go ahead, Lauren, or would you like Amy or myself to?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Sorry, let me just get this minimized so I can see the slide. So just kind of the practicalities of how to get your vaccine.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, obviously people are, well, all adults over the age of 18 now have been invited. So when you're invited by the NHS, you can book your appointment either by going on the NHS website or by phoning 119. And as you've been saying, if you're under 40, you'll only be shown appointments for the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. And if you're over 40, and you will be specifically asked if you're pregnant. So that's to make sure that you do get appointments only for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. There's also a lot of pop-up and walk-in clinics that are becoming available, lots of mass vaccination centres and things at kind of sports stadiums. And as we've got on this slide, and there's a phone number here and there's various locations where you can find information about these if you're struggling to find appointments that are suitable for you. And there's also this Hackney vaccine helpline with a number here. And obviously, if you are struggling, you do have any concerns, then you can always speak to your GP, health visitor or midwife. As Tamsin was saying about getting the vaccine done in the antenatal clinics, a lot of GP surgeries aren't doing the Pfizer vaccines or Moderna ones just because of the practicalities of having to keep it at such low temperatures. The GP surgeries are really just doing the AstraZeneca ones in the main part. But you can always call your GP surgery if you're unsure, and you can be pointed in the right direction.
Lovely.
Thank you so
much. So we are going to go to a Q&A now, I think, and I've been seeing questions popping up in the chat. Because I'm on an iPad and my computer wasn't working, I can't see the chat. So Lola, I don't know whether you or Eva were going to kind of help us with the questions, and then we can decide who's going to answer those, if that's all right.
That's absolutely fine. I can have a look through the chat now. So there were a couple of questions about the timing. First of all, in terms of when in pregnancy it is a good time to have the vaccine. If we can take that first, and then I'll have a look at the other questions in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, so we have talked a little bit about the fact that you can have the vaccine at any pregnancy, and remembering now that there are a few questions from people about whether they can have the vaccine quite close to their due date, and actually you can. There's no reason not to have it close to your due date if that's when you're booked in, or you'd like to get a bit of immunity before you give birth. Then it's absolutely fine. We don't have any cut-offs about when you can and can't have the vaccine during your pregnancy.
Yeah, that's right. So the reason that it's recommended from the second trimester, not that you couldn't have it in the first, and obviously quite a lot of women don't really know they're pregnant very early on. So if you happen to have your vaccine and then you discovered that you were pregnant while you'd been vaccinated, that you shouldn't need to worry about that. The reason I recommend it in the second trimester is that it takes a couple of weeks at least for you to start to develop the antibodies, certainly if this is your first dose, and so you'll get the maximum protection from that dose 2 to 3 weeks after you got vaccinated, and the greatest risk from having severe COVID is close to the end of pregnancy, and so that's why it's recommended then, but you can have it at any time. And a bit like Deborah said, you just need to weigh up what you think is the biggest risk. Is it from side effects from the vaccine, or is it potentially from getting COVID? And right now, with case rates rising, I'm sort of suggesting that everyone needs to think about the risk of getting infected more than the risk of side effects.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra.
Thanks so much, both. There was also another question that relates to timing, but it's on, whether if you're due to have your baby imminently, would you recommend getting the vaccine now and risk potentially dealing with side effects while in labour, or waiting for a couple of weeks until after the birth to have the vaccine whilst breastfeeding?
Well, I suppose this is the sort of thing that comes down to individual choice, really. So knowing that there's no scientific or, you know, clinical reason why you couldn't have it is one thing. Thinking about, you know, because you are taking a chance, you don't know whether you're going to be a person who gets side effects or not. So you might want to wait afterwards. And actually, if you're thinking that you're going to be at home a lot, you're not going to be exposed to a lot of risk during that couple of weeks after your baby's born, then maybe that's okay. But again, it's really going to be up to you.
Thanks so much, Tamsin. And just looking through the chat still, there was a question about the long-term effects and do we know enough? Have we been able to follow the babies whose mothers have had the vaccine whilst pregnant? And so how much do we know about the long-term effects on the babies?
So shall I take that one, Tamsin, and then you can add anything. That is a really good question. But if you remember at the beginning, I was saying that there was no biological reason why it should affect your baby. And also Tamsin was making the point that none of the vaccine components cross the placenta. So from the animal studies and from the biological, first principles, and also from the healthy normal pregnancies that we've seen so far, and the healthy babies that have resulted from the pregnancies, we don't see any impact in terms of abnormalities that occur to the baby. So even if in 2 or 3 years time you then discover that there's some developmental issue with your child, there's no sort of logical or scientific reason to link it back to the vaccine. But you're right, the babies that have been born during the period that we've been using this vaccine are only months old.
Yeah, I think it's a question of, you know, vaccines in pregnancy aren't new. The science of the mRNA vaccines isn't like it's, you know, these vaccines are new, but actually they've, like Sandra was saying, been studying this for a really long time, and they're not terribly dissimilar to the vaccines that we've been using for donkey's years, very, very safely in pregnancy. So, you know, I think that's why we feel quite confident and relaxed about recommending them, because we feel confident about the science and the way that we understand how they work.
Thank you. I'll just take one more from the chat, and then we can, if people have any questions and would like to ask them personally, then we might have time for a few more of those. But there was a question about bleeding after the vaccine, and whether there's a known reason for that. If women have taken the vaccine whilst pregnant, so having bleeding after taking the vaccine when pregnant.
I mean, Sandra, I don't know if you have any answers to that. I don't particularly. I mean, I've given the vaccine to a couple of pregnant colleagues myself and didn't have anyone who bled. I think this is a little bit of an individual thing as well. Having given quite a lot of vaccines, some people will bleed a little bit and other people's don't need it. You know, you can look and you can't see where you put the vaccine needle in. So I think it's there's not anything that I'm aware of with that, and I don't know whether Sandra has anything else.
No, and I misunderstood, or maybe just understood it differently. I assumed that that person was asking about vaginal bleeding. There's no reason for you to have that. I guess, you know, in terms of the conversation, that might be what they're particularly concerned about. So yeah, very few people bleed from the injection. Occasionally you might hit a very small blood vessel, but it wouldn't be significant bleeding. But in terms of PV bleeding, there's no biological reason, but I did actually look up the research about whether there was any link to miscarriages. And of all of those 130 something thousand women who'd had babies who'd been given the Pfizer vaccine, some of them did have who had not had babies, who were pregnant, some of them did have miscarriages, but the rate of miscarriage in that group was no different from what we'd seen pre-pandemic. So there's no reason to believe that the vaccine is associated with miscarriages or bleeding or anything like that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Would anyone like to ask a question that isn't included in the chat that we haven't addressed yet?
Actually, Deborah, I don't know if we answered your question yet about IVF, did we?
I don't think we did.
No, I said it was fine to ask the question and then totally talked about something else. Sorry about that. And yeah, the answer again is no, there isn't any reason to worry about having the vaccine during IVF treatment or having had the vaccine and then having IVF treatment. So it's again something we would recommend. And actually, if you can get protected before you start treatment, then that's even better. Do it anytime, really.
Yeah, so needless to say, there's not a lot of research about this because, you know, we've only been vaccinating people for, well, less than a year actually, or just over a year in terms of people who'd been in the trials as well. But there is one small observational study that I found where they looked at people who were going through IVF and if there was any impact on the sort of biological measurements of whether it's likely to be successful or not, like, you know, how many eggs they produced and whether there's any effect on the sperm, how many of them were able to achieve a successful fertilization in vitro, and they didn't find any impact at all. But it was a relatively small study, but there's no biological reason to believe that there would be an impact anyway.
Thank you.
You're
welcome. There's the question about Moderna versus Pfizer. I assume that means when pregnant, whether there's a difference between the two.
So both, excuse me, both vaccines use very similar technology. I couldn't say that they're identical, but they're very, very similar. The reason that we talk about Pfizer so much is just because it got to the market first and so many more people have had it. And so that gives us a lot, you know, a wealth of information about what happens with the Pfizer vaccine. But in the United States, they're using the Moderna vaccine as well as the Pfizer vaccine to vaccinate pregnant women.
Yeah, it's probably a bit like having like own brand jammy dodgers versus branded jammy dodgers, really, isn't it? They're essentially the same, but there might be some differences. Does anyone want to be brave and actually ask a question? Not in the chat. You're very welcome to. I think otherwise we're probably approaching. Oh yeah, look, we passed our time.
Yeah, we are. I was just going to. We still have the prize draw to do, obviously. So we can, if there are no more questions, we can do that.
I think I just saw something up about asking whether things will be shared, and yes. Eva, were we going to put an email address in the chat so people can, if they haven't registered, they can email us and then we will send the slides out and the recording as well. And we are going to put together a sort of Q&A as well, and we'll put the links to some of the studies and the different bits of information that Sandra and I and other, everyone's found that we think you might find useful if you want to kind of dig into those studies a little bit more. So they'll all be on there for you to have a look at afterwards as well.
Yes, definitely. We can share all the resources and we can share the recording. We might need to edit it a little bit, I don't know, with the interruption that we had, but we might be able to cut some of those bits out if needed. Lola, if you don't mind just popping in your email in the chat for people, please, so that anyone who didn't register via Eventbrite can send you an email and then be added to the distribution list. I am going to attempt to do something called the Wheel of Names live on air. Let's see how I get on with that, to pick our 3 winners who will be sent a Love to Shop voucher. So just bear with me one moment and I will try and do that. Here we go. Okay, right, are you ready? Okay. So this is our first winner. Sanidi, you'll hear from us via email. And the next one. is the second winner. And we'll do one more because we're feeling generous today. So our third winner is Neelam. Lovely.
All right, great. I feel like
everyone.
we should have done a disclaimer that if you're not watching live, you won't be entered into the draw. I feel like I'm on.
Yeah.
Can I, if we've got one more voucher, Eva, can I suggest that we also give one to Lola for handling that interruption so brilliantly?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you, Lola.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I think that we are done for the evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to everybody who organised it, and for Christine and Sandra and Deborah for joining us to talk about this. And yeah, your midwives, your doctors, everyone, your health visitors, we're all here to talk about this. Yeah, feel free to get in touch via the Homerton Maternity Instagram. Happy to have a phone call. Yeah, thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Is Ava gone? Yeah. Bye bye.